Want someone to explain and break down every piece of essential tech in Trek? Well, stay tuned. Hey Trekkies, Christian Fox here with another video for you. Today, I want to explain and break down every single piece of essential tech in Star Trek. And by essential, I mean the things that you need to hear about because you can't go 2 seconds without them showing up. Like if you turn a random episode of Star Trek on, you're probably going to hear about your communicators, your transporters, and your warp drives. All right, let's start with the most important and most foundational piece of tech in Trek, the warp drive. Warp drive is a faster-than-light travel that most ships in Star Trek use to roll around the galaxy. Although warp drive was already in use by other species in the 1950s, possibly earlier, it wasn't until 2063 that humans began using the technology thanks to Zefram Cochrane, as seen in the film Star Trek First Contact. Warp drive essentially creates a subspace bubble around a ship, allowing the ship to move faster than the speed of light. Warp drive speeds are typically referred to as factors and go from warp factor 1 all the way up to warp factor 9.9. The warp scale is somewhat confusing because it wasn't made consistent until Star Trek The Next Generation. In the original series, the warp scale always seemed to change, as the impossible warp speed could be warp 9 or warp 11 depending on the episode. By the TNG era, specifically in Star Trek Voyager, the fastest warp speed was warp 10. Warp 10 was so fast it could get you anywhere instantaneously, though it's not really a great travel option because it has the strange effect of putting you everywhere all at once, and it might turn you into a space lizard. While Warp 1 through 4 were impressive and allowed for interstellar travel, it wasn't until Warp 5 that exploring the galaxy became possible. The first starship to use the Warp 5 engine was the NX-01 Enterprise, commanded by Jonathan Archer, as seen in Star Trek Enterprise. As great as warp drive is, it does cause damage to subspace over time, and for a while, speed limits were imposed, as seen in the TNG Season 7 episode, Force of Nature. However, that story was quickly dropped by the time Star Trek Voyager came out, and the USS Voyager itself seemed to solve that problem with her nacelles arcing up when they would go to warp, but that was really never confirmed on screen. The amazing speeds of warp drive is all made possible thanks to dilithium crystals and the matter-antimatter reaction in the warp core, and they also need deuterium, but that seems to come and go. Dilithium crystals and deuterium are super easy to find, unless they're not. Transporters. A transporter is a device that allows a person, animal, or object to be taken from one location to another location almost instantaneously. Basically, the transporter converts the desired subject into energy that is stored in a transporter buffer and then sent to the desired location where it's reconverted into its original pattern. And this is called beaming, which happens in the transporter room most of the time. Transporters have been used all over the galaxy, but it wasn't until around 2124 that humans began using the technology thanks to Emory Erickson, as seen in Star Trek Enterprise. And don't worry, transporters are absolutely the safest way to travel. Well, unless, of course, you're transporting through an ion storm, in which case you might get sent to an evil universe where everyone wants to kill you, or unless you're being up from a planet with a strange atmosphere that might create a clone of you that makes you reevaluate your whole life, or unless you're beaming up from a planet with a strange plant that turns you and a friend into a single being, or unless, of course, someone engages the transporter before installing a transporter sensor module, in which case you're just straight up dead. But seriously, it's perfectly safe. Even when transporters are working perfectly, they still have some limitations. They can only work across short distances, such as beaming down to a planet. They can't beam through shields, except when they can, and they can't operate if there's too much interference, such as quantum interference or other kinds of interference that sounds cool and is appropriate for the plot. Transporters are super common in Star Trek and are loved by most people. I say most people because Dr. McCoy and Lieutenant Barclay had the good sense to be a little cautious around the transporter. Communicators. As the name suggests, the communicator is a device that people use to talk to each other, and, well, they basically use it like a cell phone. Communicators themselves have taken many different forms. In the original series, and even Enterprise, communicators resemble flip-up cell phones, and of course, legend has it that the cell phone was based on the communicator. Communicators of this era looked like black boxes with gold mesh, and the Enterprise communicators were very similar but different in design with black and silver. In this form, the communicators were primarily used by away teams on planets to communicate with the ship. It wasn't really used for intership communication except for certain episodes like Mirror Mirror where Kirk and the gang had to communicate with each other discreetly. For intership communication, one would have to use a comm panel, which often resulted in Kirk slamming the panel with his fist, a habit I indulge in anytime I turn lights on and off, and I do not apologize for it. Although the flip-up communicator isn't super advanced by our standards, it contains the basis for all 23rd century technology as stated by Spock. By the time of Captain Picard in the 24th century and the spin-offs, communicators became much more advanced. Instead of flip-up devices, communicators took the form of a metal Starfleet Delta that could be placed on uniforms. All one had to do was simply tap the communicator, or comm badge as it's sometimes called, and say the name of the person they're trying to reach. With this design, it became more common to use for intership communication. Of course, it's still used for away teams on alien planets. Communicators themselves have a multitude of features beyond simply talking to someone who's in a different location. They can sometimes be used as a beacon that the transporter can log onto. Often characters will say, "Log on to my comm badge and beam us out." But even more impressively, they can help people that speak different languages have a conversation with each other using the Universal Translator, or UT as it's often called. The UT is a whole video in itself, but let's just say it's the reason that everybody on Star Trek seems to speak English. Communicators seem to have the ability to act as long-range communication devices, as seen in Star Trek Into Darkness when Kirk, who's on the Enterprise, skulls Scotty, who's on Earth, but that has been debated by fans for almost a decade. While primarily seen within Starfleet, most warp-faring species have some version of the communicator. Phasers. A phaser is a directed energy weapon that fires a Nadion particle beam and is the primary weapon of choice for Starfleet. Phasers come in all different sizes. They can be small handheld weapons, also called Type 1, which are super small, almost miniature, or Type 2, the classic handheld phasers, or large ship-mounted weapons, often called Type 4 or above. They also come in different shapes. Earlier phasers, like the phased pistols of the 22nd century as seen in Star Trek Enterprise, or the phasers of the 23rd century as seen in the original series, resemble guns. Phasers from the 24th century as seen on TNG and later resemble a curved TV remote for the lack of a better word. Although the two main settings of phasers are kill and stun, most Starfleet models have 16 settings that can perform a wide variety of functions. For example, they can stun a large group of people when set to a wide beam, or vaporize a target when set to maximum. Phasers can even be used to heat rocks, be used as a precision cutting tool, or even be used as a bomb when set to overload. The Type 2 phaser was the main weapon carried by Starfleet personnel and part of the standard gear set for away teams. The Type 3 phaser is the big brother of the Type 2 and resembles a rifle. Now, shockingly, they actually call them phaser rifles. Phaser rifles have 16 beam settings, fully autonomous recharge, multiple target acquisition, and gyro stabilization. Later phaser rifles, such as the ones featured in First Contact, shoot energy pulses instead of beams. In Voyager, on the other hand, they use compression rifles instead of the regular phaser rifle, and these fire beams instead of pulses. And because I've said rifle so many times, I feel like I should say rifle one more time, so here it is, rifle. To make things even more confusing, phaser rifles are sometimes identified as Type 3 Mark I, Type 3 Mark II, and Type 3 Mark III. Phasers are great and all, but they can't tell you what something is. For that, you need a tricorder. Tricorders. From its first introduction in the original series, the tricorder has been depicted as an almost magical portable scanning device that gives users seemingly limitless information about whatever they're scanning. It can be anything from alien life forms to strange spores to strange atmospheres to strange planets, all the usual sci-fi stuff. The tricorder also seems to know exactly what information the user is looking for, which I realize is more of a TV thing because obviously you can't have characters standing around opening up their tricorders and navigating complex menus to find whatever they want to scan, but it does seem a little convenient. The tricorder itself has taken many various forms, with the design changing throughout Star Trek's run. In the original series, tricorders took the form of a black rectangular box with silver outlines and two silver panels with a dial, buttons, lights, and a screen that are revealed when the flap is moved open. Officers wore the tricorder much like a messenger bag or a man purse, which is why when I do wear a messenger bag or a man purse, I sometimes like to pretend that I'm scanning things even though I know it's not actually a tricorder. By the time of TNG and the other spin-offs, tricorders became much smaller and more pocket-friendly. Almost like a foldable cell phone, the tricorder was a gray rectangle that could fold and contained a small screen, some lights, and buttons. The design got much sleeker, and by the time of Star Trek Nemesis, the tricorder resembled an iPhone. In Star Trek Enterprise, set 100 years before the original series, the tricorder resembled a metal rectangular silver box with a slide-up blue screen and controls on the base. By the time of Star Trek Discovery in the 32nd century, tricorder functionality was rolled into the communicator along with transporter capabilities. While tricorders primarily function as a scanner, they can do many other tasks such as take detailed holographic recordings, open locks, interface with computers, remote detonate bombs, and even more depending on the episode and the series. In addition to standard tricorder, medical staff use a medical tricorder, which is obviously more useful in medical situations than a regular tricorder. Much like other tech in Star Trek, most alien species seem to have their version of the Starfleet tricorder. Photon torpedoes. A photon torpedo, aka simply photons or simply torpedoes, is a warp-capable matter-antimatter projectile weapon used by the Federation and other galactic powers such as the Klingons. Typically, torpedoes are used as a secondary weapon. Photon torpedoes are extremely precise and powerful. They can destroy something as small as a ship's communications array or something as large as an entire city. Torpedoes can even devastate the firing ship if they fire a little too close and without shields. Photon torpedoes themselves are armed with photon warheads and a detonation chamber filled with antimatter. All these intense-sounding things are contained within a photon tube. Obviously, torpedoes are super powerful, but they all have different capabilities depending on the type that is being used. For Starfleet ships such as the Enterprise D, a standard torpedo has at least 16 different yields. A torpedo with a 25 isoton yield can destroy an entire city. If you need even more power, Starfleet ships can use high-yield warheads. Voyager used a high-yield warhead to take out a group of Species 8472 ships in one shot. But if that's still not enough, a torpedo can be equipped with a gravimetric charge, which is basically enough firepower to destroy a small moon. Torpedoes are fired from various torpedo launchers. Most ships have forward and aft launchers. They can be fired one at a time or as a volley. Nothing sounds cooler than when characters say, "Photon torpedoes, full spread!" Torpedoes in the time of Kirk in the 23rd century had to manually be loaded. By the time of Picard in the 24th century, that process was automated. When it comes to the type of photon torpedoes, things get complicated because Starfleet uses many different terms. In some cases, they use the term mark, such as a Mark 6 torpedo, which is used by the Enterprise refit in Enterprise A. In other cases, they use the term type or the term class. Voyager has Type 6 torpedoes, as well as Class 9 and Class 10 torpedoes. Outside of blowing stuff up, photon torpedoes can do a lot of other useful things. They can be used as a flare to shed light on a situation when sensors are ineffective. They can be used as mines. They can be used to locate cloaked ships, such as when Spock and McCoy modified one to track the ionized gas from Chang's super cheap bird of prey that can fire while cloaked, and they can even eliminate atmospheric radiation. On a downer note, torpedo casings are often used as coffins for fallen officers, the most famous example being Spock. Torpedoes can also inadvertently cause spatial rifts to form, such as the Kerr loop that was created by Romulan photon torpedoes during a firefight. If that isn't enough info, things get even more confusing when you consider that there are other types of torpedoes that aren't photons. There are photonic torpedoes, which are precursors to photon torpedoes as used by the NX-01 in Star Trek Enterprise. There are plasma torpedoes, which are used by the Cardassians. And of course, there are quantum torpedoes, which are used by Starfleet ships like the Enterprise E and the Defiant. The quantum torpedo uses a plasma-based warhead. Quantum torpedoes might sound silly, but believe me, there is nothing cooler than quantum torpedoes. Photon torpedoes have appeared all throughout the franchise and are a true Star Trek staple. Oh, and please let me know how many times I've said photon torpedoes, because I love saying photon torpedoes. In fact, I want to say photon torpedoes so much that I want to say photon torpedo one more time. Photon torpedo. Shields. Shields, aka deflector shields, or sometimes called screens as in TOS, is the technology starships and space stations use to protect themselves from weapon fire or harmful space phenomena like radiation and ion storms. Basically, shields are a layer or layers of energetic distortion with a high concentration of gravitons which form around the protected object. The shields are generated by deflector dish such as the ship's navigational deflector or emitters along the hull. Shields can either form a bubble, yes, a bubble, around the protected object, or conform to the specific object. It seems the Enterprise refit and Enterprise A uses the conforming shields based on the shield displays, but we don't actually see the shield impact effects in those films. Personally, I've always been confused by shields sometimes being a bubble and sometimes not, especially for the degenerations, completely forgetting that we've already seen the shield bubble in many episodes such as The Best of Both Worlds. Shields themselves are very strong and have been shown to take serious firepower. One example is the Enterprise refit surviving against one of V'ger's energy blasts, though just barely. Even so, successive hits can weaken shields to the point of failure. Shield strength is denoted by percentage, with tactical officers yelling things like, "Shields at 60%! Starfleet ship shields, try saying that 5 times fast. Starfleet ship shields, 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 are divided into 6 sections. These are forward, port, aft, starboard, dorsal, and ventral. I assume it's the same for non-Federation ships such as the Klingon Bird of Prey, but I'm not positive. This means that ships can either reinforce specific sections or that ships can target specific sections. One important thing about shields is that they can sometimes prevent beaming. In TOS, the Enterprise couldn't beam people up while shields were raised, but Voyager somehow did this all the time. I'm not sure if it was just an error or if the tech really improved that much. In addition to being fired upon by standard weapons, shields were weak against solar flares, and Federation ships were very weak against the Dominion, well, at least for a while. Shields could also be breached by weapons with the matching frequency. Just ask Geordi, who accidentally destroyed the Enterprise D by glancing at a panel with the ship's shield frequency on it. A frequency of 257.4. Adjust our weapons to match. 257.4. Or whatever she says. The odd thing about Star Trek shields, which is really never explained on screen, is that the shields themselves don't seem to actually stop weapons from hitting the ship's hull. They just simply seem to weaken the attack, minimizing the damage. Now, this might explain why consoles are always exploding in people's faces and sparks are always flying everywhere, even when shield strength is very, very high. Again, never really explained on screen, but something to think about. On a side note, I've always loved the shield that Atlantis has in Stargate Atlantis because of how strong it actually is. Literally, nothing can breach it as long as they have enough ZPMs. Man, I would love a world where I could also run a Yelling About Stargate channel and still make enough videos for this one, but right now, just too many things going on. One bonus thing about shields is that they can even be extended around something else. In Voyager extended its shields around the less powerful and significantly more damaged Equinox. The only downside is that the shields are a little weaker when extended. Throughout Trek, we've seen many different types of shields, such as multiphasic shields, whatever that is. Actually, it's a type of shielding that can allow a ship to fly into a star's corona. Regenerative shields, polarized hull plating, as seen in Enterprise, and of course, ablative armor. Ablative armor is used by the Defiant in DS9 and future Admiral Janeway outfitted Voyager with future ablative armor via the ablative armor generator. Shields in Trek are mostly used by ships and space stations and sometimes the occasional planet, but they can also be used by homes like Riker and Troy's home in Picard, and even by individuals like individual Borg drones. Why Starfleet doesn't use portable shield emitters for its officers is beyond me, but that is a video for a different time. Holodeck. The holodeck is a room that can create 3D holographic simulations. Users can create everything from simple settings such as a forest to characters to complex interactive stories, scenarios, and yes, even shall we say, funny business, especially at Quarks. The holograms themselves are so realistic that it's almost impossible to tell that they're holograms. A small holodeck or holosuite, as they say on DS9, can make one feel that they are in large areas such as a crowded city. Holograms are created by the manipulation of photons contained within force fields. Replicator and transporter technology are used to create these projections. Everybody got that? To control a holodeck, one need only give the computer verbal commands like end program or ask for the arch. The arch has physical controls and doors to exit. Holodecks run on a separate power grid so they can still be used even when main power is limited. Holodecks themselves are perfectly harmless thanks to the safety protocols. These safeties ensure that things that are normally fatal, such as bullets, are rendered completely harmless. Thankfully, these safety protocols never fail, and thankfully they can't be turned off by officers with the proper authorization. Actually, that's not true. Unfortunately, safeties fail all the time due to sci-fi phenomena like crazy transporter accidents. And to make matters even worse, officers definitely turn them off. But the danger doesn't stop there. Some holograms have become self-aware, the most famous example being Professor Moriarty. In the classic episode, Elementary Dear Data, Geordi, in an effort to make the Sherlock Holmes program more challenging for Data, asked the computer to create someone that could match Data's ability. The computer then gives Moriarty self-awareness, which allows him to take over the ship. Thanks a lot, Geordi. Another safety feature that isn't talked about as much are the perceptual filters. These filters prevent holograms from seeing and understanding things that are not part of the program. For example, a holographic character won't notice someone calling the user from the bridge. Of course, these perceptual filters can also fail, such as the time the townspeople of Fairhaven started believing that Voyager crew members were using black magic when they saw Harry and Tom changing things in the program. But wait, there's more! Because holodecks are so real, our various heroes can find themselves trapped in holodecks and not even realize it. In one instance, Dr. Bashir was trapped in the Section 31 interrogation program in which he believed he was still on DS9. There's also the issue of holo addiction. The most famous example of this is Reg Barkley in both TNG and Voyager. In those situations, Barkley became so addicted to the holodeck that he would spend hours upon hours in them, and in Voyager, even created holographic quarters. Seven also briefly experienced a form of holo addiction when she was exploring her humanity as a more human member of the crew. Frankly, holodecks are dangerous, and there are just too many examples of them failing or being used by bad guys to list them all. But my favorites include the time that some of the DS9 crew members were trapped in Bash's Bond-like secret program where they believed that they were characters in the program, courtesy of a transporter accident. The time that Tom and Tuvok were trapped in a holo novel that was being controlled by an evil holographic version of Seska. And finally, the time that the Hirogen took over Voyager and placed the crew in various holo programs where they believed that they were the actual characters in the program. Although holodecks are mostly used for entertainment, they can be used for investigative purposes, such as when Geordi worked with a holographic version of the Galaxy-class designer, Leah Brahms. No comment on that whole situation. Holodecks can even be used for therapy, such as when Nog used it to work through his war-related trauma. Replicator. A replicator is a handy-dandy piece of technology that can basically create anything instantly. Of course, these are not to be confused with the replicators from Stargate, who are super powerful beings entirely made up of nanites and make the Borg look like a AAA battery. Replicators can create clothing and technology, but are mostly used to create food. Basically, the replicator converts energy into matter. Worried about all the dirty dishes it creates? Well, fear not, because all you need to do is simply put them back and they'll be reabsorbed. I'll tell you, the first thing I would do if I had a replicator would be to program in the recipe for McCain's Pizza Pockets and then compare the replicated ones with the real ones and see which one was better. And if I'm being truthful about my past, Pizza Pockets were my go-to Trek food before I became a little more health conscious. And speaking of health, replicators can make unhealthy foods healthy, or at least relatively healthy. Just ask Counselor Troy, who had to be very specific with the computer about her real chocolate sundae needs. As awesome as replicators are, they do have some limits. For one thing, there's certain things they can't replicate, such as latinum, and for another thing, they are limited by their available power. In Voyager, crew members often had to use replicator rations as a way of conserving power, given that they were far from home and couldn't necessarily refuel. This meant that crew members would sometimes have to indulge in Neelix's famous Leola root stew. Of course, there are also imposed limits. Starfleet replicators can't create uniforms for civilians, much to Neelix's dismay, or create poisons. When it comes to replicators, you have everything from the smaller food and beverage ones all the way to the big industrial boys. And replicators are also everywhere, such as crew quarters, transporter rooms, command centers, homes, bars, restaurants, and even holodecks. Replicators are mostly seen in the TNG era series and later. TOS uses a food synthesizer, which appears to be a much more primitive version of the replicator, but the ones we see in Discovery and Strange New Worlds seem to be full-on replicators. All of this tech is great, but what about all those people in those funny uniforms?